Good morning, everyone. On behalf of faculty research and Office of Research here in Rockford, and thank you for joining. Today we have a talk from Dr. Susan Ross. I want to introduce now the head of the department and active researcher in Department of Microbiology and Immunology, College of Medicine, University of Illinois at College of Chicago. She had tremendous experience starting from 1972 on research. She mentored many students and more than 150 peer-reviewed publications, several NIH grants, and most I want to highlight about publications are high impact journals, and also the mentoring of graduate students, and which also shows that she was active in this area of publications, and that's what we want to hear today. I want to thank you so much for your time and effort for supporting this program at College of Medicine here in our campus. Thank you, Dr. Susan Ross, and I will hand over to you for taking this seminar. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. So I'm just going to say that, first of all, this is the slide deck was originally developed by the PLOS publication organization. I've changed a few of the slides, but if anybody wants a copy of the slides, I am able to give them to you. So you should just email me and I'll send it to anyone who requests it. So what I'm going to talk about today is how to write your papers. They will be possible for a prestigious research journal. And it's not working. Just to tell you a little bit from what Dr. Matthews told you about me, I am also currently the section editor for the HIV and retroviruses section for PLOS pathogens. I'm co-editor-in-chief of Retrovirology. I'm on the editorial committee of the annual review of virology, and I was a former senior editor at the Journal of Virology. So I have experience in knowing what a wide variety of different journals are looking for in terms of publications. So what I'm going to try to talk about today is how to imagine, define, and focus your study so it appeals to the journal of your choice, and hopefully the top journal of your choice. So these are some tips for trying to figure out where you, how to frame your research. So first of all, the most important thing is to understand the scope of the journal you want to publish in. And not every study is suited to every journal. So it's really important to try to match your study with the right journal. The second really important thing is to pick and choose. So don't try to publish everything in your lab notebooks, and try to choose only the parts that are relevant to telling a narrative, because the rest can be very distracting. And also, you don't always have to present the data in a manuscript in the order that the experiments were done. So the important thing is to present them in a way that it makes a really good story. And in order to understand the scope of the journal, you should read recent work in that journal to get a sense for the bar. And the bar will move as more is added to the literature. So what might have been acceptable in a top journal not be the same bar anymore, because more has been published in that area. So it's really important to try to figure out whether your work is acceptable to that journal. Right, so to be considered for publication, originality is really critical. So you need to evaluate your research to understand what's already been shown, and are your findings incremental, confirmatory, or groundbreaking. The work has to be of high importance to researchers in the field and also to the greater scientific community. And unfortunately, if your field is really small, it's often hard to publish in general journals, because what these journals are looking at is for research that's only of high importance to researchers in the field, but is of broad interest to the community. So is it something that everybody is going to want to read? You need to have rigorous methodology. So more and more journals and funding agencies like NIH are concerned about what methods were used, how completely they are reported, and how reproducible they are. I'll talk a little bit about that more later on. And there has to be substantial evidence for the conclusion of your paper. So you have to make sure that you highlight the significance of your conclusions, but don't overstate your conclusions, because that'll be instant grounds for not getting accepted. Okay, so when you're designing your research, when you're thinking about what research you're going to do, you should design your study with the paper you intend to write in mind. So you should have clear research objectives that'll help you determine the logical flow for conducting the experiments and organizing them when you go to write the paper. And you should take the time to stop and evaluate of the experiments and the validity of the results, and then revise the project as needed. And as you design your study, you need to consider the potential effect of the eventual paper on the subject and field. So this will help you write the paper, help you decide which elements of your research to conclude, and help you to figure out where you should submit the final paper. So you've done the research. Now let's look at the ways to make sure that it can be published, and published where you want to publish it. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how to avoid a rejection letter from an editor. So dear authors, thanks for asking whether we'd like to publish your paper. Your paper is good and original, but unfortunately we're not willing to publish it because the good bits were not original and the original bits were not good. Yours faithfully, the editors. So why do journals reject our groundbreaking work? So it's not because necessarily the work isn't good enough to be published, but it has to do with how the paper was written. So if the paper is poorly written and poorly structured, the editor can't fathom what it means, or they can't glean from it the importance of the research. And editors are human, and they're impressed by papers that are short, easy to read, and contain a clear message. So what's yours? So it kind of reminds me of what a friend told me about grant writing, that you should write your grants so that the reviewer can be in the bathtub drinking a glass of wine and still read the grant. And that's true for editors and papers as well. You need to have a very, very clear message that comes across in the paper. Okay, so think about what you're going to put. Think about things to think about before you put the pen to paper. Selling yourself, how you're going to capture an editor's attention. Structure of the paper. Without a clear structure, you and the editor will be lost. And you should try to have effective writing. So there are some very simple rules that can make a huge difference. So you want to ask what, where, and how. If the editors cannot work out your single take-home message, they'll reject your paper. They'll also reject it if you haven't convinced them of the importance. So you need to review your results to determine what the message will be. So as I said, you have to choose a journal and write for that journal's audience. Make sure the journal publishes your type of study. You need to understand what the audience already knows about the topic and what would they want to know. Do your results and conclusions fit within the scope of the journal? And importantly, always read the author guidelines specific for the journal you're submitting to. So what happens when you submit to a journal? So this is an example of what happens when you submit to a PLOS journal. So the first thing the paper undergoes is technical checks. And so the journal staff checks for formatting requirements and ethical compliance. And the paper will be sent back for minor changes if you don't meet those requirements. And the ethical compliance now is especially important. There are a lot of questions that are asked if you're doing human subjects, if you're doing animal research and other ethical things. And those are always looked at right away by the technical staff. Once it passes the technical checks, it gets assigned to an editor. In PLOS journals, they're called section editors. And then there's an internal editorial review. So the section editor may invite editorial board members or specific other reviewers to discuss the paper's suitability for the journal. They may do this on their own as well. And they will talk about what they look at in a few slides to make that decision. But very often before the paper is sent out for peer review, it will be rejected at this stage of the review process. So it won't get sent out for external peer review. If it does pass this stage, it gets sent for peer review, and then there's a decision. We'll talk more about that. Okay, so different journals have this process of not sending a paper out for review is called triage or reject without review. And different journals have different triage processes. So Science, Nature, Cell publications, unlike the PLOS journals where it's done by scientists, they have professional editors who don't necessarily know your research area. Sometimes, but not always, they confer with their scientific editors who are scientists before making the first decision. But for these journals, most rejections occur at this level. So you really have to make your paper catchy for this type of journal in order to make it past the reject or the triage stage. As I said, at PLOS, we have section editors and associate editors, and the manuscript is always assigned to a section editor who's a semi-expert in the field, who assigns an associate editor who's more expert in the field, and they will choose the appropriate reviewers after the editorial board discussion. And almost every journal now has a similar type of first round editorial review. So all of these journals have the RWOR decision, reject without review decision. What are usually the catchphrases that accompany the rejection letter? So not a broad enough conceptual advance. So that's what I talked about before. You really have to show that you're advancing the field, that it's too specialized, not of broad interest. So these journals want to appeal to a broad range of readers. So it has to be of broad interest. It's descriptive. You need to have a deeper understanding of the underlying mechanisms. So there are many papers that we publish that report sort of phenomena without being able to say why those things occur. And in general, for high impact journals, you need to have some mechanistic insight. Maybe that's not so true these days if you're publishing about SARS-CoV-2, because there are a lot of papers that are just phenomena papers that are getting published. But in general, this is true. So the first step is to make sure that, again, I'm just going to reiterate this again, is the scope within the journal's interest? Does it have a clear message? Is it original? Is it important? Is it true? Is it relevant to our readers? So you have to sell yourself to get through RWOR. So what's the first thing an editor looks at? The cover letter. So a lot of times when we're writing cover letters to our papers, we think it's just a formality, but it turns out, particularly for these high impact journals, that the editors look at the cover letter and try to assess whether this is an important publication or not, or important manuscript. So don't waste the opportunity to work. Don't write something dull or derivative. Please consider this manuscript for publication in your esteemed journal. You have to tell the editor why they should take your work seriously. So the points to make in the cover letter is why the study is a conceptual advance, what is the breakthrough, who will the study be of interest to, tell them which field, research area the study touches upon. So for I'll give an example. For me, I may be studying a gene or a protein that's involved in inhibiting virus replication, but this gene may also be important in the field of cancer, or it may be important in the field of developmental biology. So when I write the cover letter, I say all of these things, because if I say this is of interest to people who are studying animal retroviruses, the manuscript will be rejected without before even getting to the review stage. And you need to convince the editors that the study is appropriate to their journal. So the broader interest the journal is, the broader interest your study should be. So what's the second thing an editor looks at? The title. So you have to make the title compelling. It should be concise. It should be informative. It should words related to the topic. It should entice the reader without giving away the punchline and not be over sensationalized. So here's an example of a bad title: temporary depletion of complement component C3 or genetic deficiency of C1q significantly delays onset of scrapie. So why is this title bad? There's too much methodological detail. It obscures the take-home message. So the good title that describes this research would be Complement Facilitates Early Prion Pathogenesis. The take-home message is really, really clear. It's simple. You don't have to think about what the research is about. You know immediately what's going on. Here's another example. Reverse genetics reveals a role of the rotavirus VP3 phosphodiesterase activity in inhibiting RNA cells, signaling and contributing to intestinal viral replication in vitro. Again, too much detail in the title. Rotavirus VP3 phosphodiesterase inhibits RNA cell and contributes to intestinal viral replication. Very, very straightforward take-home message, very, very straightforward description of the work. So the thing is, you'll notice these examples are all for the virology field because this is from PLOS pathogens. So integrin alpha VB5 internalizes Zika virus during neural stem cell infection and provides a promising target for antiviral therapy. Zika virus targets glioblastoma stem cells through a SOC2 integrin alpha 5 axis. So you can see that the second title really simplifies the take-home message. Okay, what's the third thing an editor looks at? And to be honest, for the top tier journals, especially the ones that don't go through scientific editors, but go through general editorial staff, there are really only three things that the editors look at. They look at the cover letter, the title, and the abstract, and they don't usually look at the paper. If they've already made the decision, they're not interested. Okay, so many journals now base their decisions on the abstract alone. And many authors write the abstract in a great rush, almost as an afterthought. Personally, I think you should write your abstract first, or perhaps, write a outline of your paper that allows you to write the abstract, because then it might even help you figure out what's missing from your paper. So it should be a concise standalone piece with a very clear message. It has to accurately reflect the text of the paper, and it should tell the reader, what did you study? Why did you do the study? What did you do? What conclude? Just as an aside, there is another thing that editors will often like, I guess, which is called a pre-submission inquiry. So many high impact journals prefer this. and of course they're critical because you don't even send in the paper. So that's why writing a great abstract is really important. And pre-submission inquiries can be useful sometimes. It saves time if you're not sure about the suitability of your research. And so then you don't have to, if the editors tell you they're not interested, then you know not to format your paper for that particular journal. Okay. Help you organize your ideas. You don't have to present it in this background, methodology, results, and conclusion, but you have to think about it in a structured way. So here's an example of, this is an interesting example of an abstract because the conclusion that's found in the results is a negative conclusion. But, or in the results, they say we did not find a correlation. So that's a negative result. But these authors have come to a conclusion that's really, really important for understanding the epidemial implications. So this is an abstract that's about trypanosomes, and they give a short background of 1 to 2 sentences. They give 1 to 2 sentences discussing the methodology. They give 2 sentences describing the results, and then they give 2 sentences describing the conclusions. And so it would be written in a narrative way, not with these different breaks, but it gives you all the information you need. Okay, so I have a couple of examples of well-written abstracts and poorly written abstracts. So I'm just going to go, I'm not going to go through everyone in detail, but let's look at this one. So let's look at the poorly written abstract first. So in this study, we examined where immune cells and nerve fibers are located patches with a view to identifying potential sites for neuroinvasion by prions. Special attention was paid to dendritic cells viewed as candidate transporters of infectious prion. So right away, the one problem with this abstract is it's not really telling you why this is an important study in the field. And in fact, they never get to that in this abstract. And when we go through the well-written version, you'll see what they did, what the difference is. So then they go through a lot of technical details, double immunofluorescence labeling with anti-CD11C antibody, and markers for other immune cells were carried out and analyzed by confocal microscopy on Peyer's patch cryosections. And then they even use more technical details. And then finally, they get to the results where they say in the suprafollicular dome, dendritic cells connect via their cytoplasmic extensions, enterocytes with M cells of the follicle-associated epithelium. They're also close to B and T cells. Then they talk about nerve cells, and then they see similar connections with other cells. And then they find that germinal centers are not innervated, but they never really tell us what the important take-home message is, right? So they give a lot of technical detail, a lot of detailed results, but what was important about what they found? Okay, so let's look at the well-written version of this. So right off the bat, why is this study important? The involvement of immune cells in prion capture and transport to lymphoid tissue still remains unclear, right? Right away, we know what the problem they're trying to address is. To investigate this, the role of dendritic cells, we use DTR mice, a transgenic model designed to trigger short-term ablation of DCs. Transient depletion of DCs around the time of IP infection delayed prion replication in the spleen, as followed by PRPC amount, a specific hallmark of prion diseases. So they tell us what the methods used, but very briefly. They tell us how they did it. They tell us the result. Consequently, neuroinvasion and incubation time of prion disease were delayed. In contrast, no differences were observed after oral infection. And then the final take-home message, these results suggest that DCs act as vectors for prions from the peripheral entry site to the spleen. So very clearly written. So what is the background here, right? They do have a sign for background, but it's kind of a cryptic background. The methodology, the results are not distinct, and they're really, really long, and there's no conclusion. So here, what's the background? Really clear. Methodology is really clear. Results are really clear, and conclusion. Okay. So additional abstract writing tips. Many readers use search engines to look for information. So in search engine terms, the title of your article is an interesting element, and you need to reiterate keywords or phrases from the title in your abstract. And it's best to focus on a maximum of 3 to 4 keyword phrases in the abstract. Okay, so you've made it past editorial triage or RWOR. What's the next most important? Style. So make sure you read and follow the journal's author guidelines and style guide, and make sure you follow the guidelines for specific types of studies. So microarray data, systematic reviews, so a meta-analysis, observational epidemiology, RCTs, which are clinical trials, and studies of diagnostic accuracy use START. And there's many, many others of these types of guidelines. So you should make sure that your research follows these guidelines. So readers should know throughout the piece where they've come from, where they are now, and where they are headed. So structure. There's a title page, there's an abstract, we've already talked about that. And then there's IRDM, the introduction, results and discussion, materials and methods. And then of course, acknowledgements, references, figures and figure legends and tables. So in the introduction, you want to grab the reader, draw them immediately to the crucial issue that your paper addresses, keep it short, 2 to 3 paragraphs. So set the scene and give the state of the art rather than describe everything known on the topic. So make sure you're only citing papers that are relevant to what you're going to be talking about in the paper. Tell the reader why your research was needed. Why does it matter to scientists, doctors, patients, policymakers, or researchers? Were there any controversies that you're trying to resolve, to address? What did you do that was new or innovative? And don't give away the results or conclusions in any big way in the introduction. So that's one mistake that a lot of people make, is that they reiterate the same thing in the introduction, in the results, and the discussion. So you might want to summarize those things in different sections, but you don't want to say the same thing over and over again. So good practice points for the introduction. The opening sentence takes you straight to the issue. It contains the most important details of the issue. It contains a brief summary of the controversies and the best evidence. It ends in a crisp and clear research question and how you set out to answer it. And it keeps with the rules of good writing and is written using active rather than passive tense. So there are a few journals that like the passive tense, but most journals prefer the active tense these days. So we did this, we did that, not it was shown, it was found. Okay. Here, so here's an abstract. You can see it's short, so it follows the rules that I just told you. And let's look at it and see if there was a crisp and clear research question, and did they answer a question? So, transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, TSE, are inexorably fatal neurodegenerative disorders caused by prions, which consist of PRPSC, a protease-resistant isoform of the normal cellular prion protein, PRPC. The knockout mice that lack PRPC cannot generate PRPSC and withstand prion inoculation. PRPC forms aggregates that grow by recruiting PRPC and whose breakage underlies prion replication. So the hallmarks of TSEs include SC, deposition and progressive brain damage. I don't think they do have a clear and crisp research question here. They have a reasonably good synopsis of what they're studying, but I would have preferred right from the very beginning that they tell us what the research question that they're asking is, rather than telling us all the background. So they then go on to say that COCS can be infected with various prion strains, with prions titers peaking within 4 weeks. So I don't know what a COCS is. They probably need to define this in their in the abstract, in the introduction. They may have defined it in the abstract, but I think they should redefine it in the introduction as well. And then they tell us what they report, and then they now talk about what they observe. And again, I don't feel like they tell us what question it is that they answered. So I don't think this is a good introduction. Okay. So again, let's go back to what I said here. So you need to have an opening sentence that takes you straight to the issue, contains the most important issue, contains a brief summary of the controversies and the best evidence, and ends in a crisp and clear research question. And I don't feel that that abstract did that. Okay, so now let's talk about the results. So in the results, it should be the facts and nothing but the facts. So it should be ordered around primary and secondary outcomes in the same orders as listed in the methods section. It should state clearly and simply what you found. And there shouldn't be conclusions. So you should just be reporting what the data are and save the conclusions or interpretations for the discussion section. Use tables and figures for the main numbers. Don't duplicate information in text and tables. And if it belongs in the discussion, don't put it in the results. So many readers look at abstract and figures and then decide whether to read the paper or not. So figures and tables are really, really important. I don't know how you do this, but I often look at papers and just look at the figures without necessarily reading the text very carefully before I decide whether I want to read the text and see what the authors are saying about their research. So each figure or table should have one standalone message. You shouldn't overload the figures or tables with numbers or text, so they should be concise. They should be entirely understandable on their own without reference to the whole paper or the need to read methods or results. And don't discuss what your findings mean in the figure legends. Okay, so here's the figures from the paper that we read the abstract and introduction to. So this is figure 1. So figure 1 reads, A, localization and consequences of prion replication in Cox. The title of the figure is fine because that's going to tell the reader what they're looking at. Fluorescence micrographs showing profound loss of new N+ cerebellar granule cells. I'm not going to read it the whole thing. So in my opinion, what I've highlighted in red belongs in the figure legend. I'm sorry, does not all belong in the figure legend, because they actually give you some conclusions in this figure legend, because they say no neuronal damage was detected in Cox exposed to non-infectious brain homogenate. That should be in your results section. Okay. Then this part B, right? So I would cross out that last sentence. Oops. Part B, the rest of the figure legend is fine. So that this part B has electron microscopy showing membrane enclosed intraneural spongiform vacuoles. It just describes what's it seen in the figure. Part C just describes what's shown in the immunoblots. And then part D shows histoblots. And again, they say kind of what the results were in the last sentence of Part D. So no signal was observed in COX and expressing cells. That should really be in the results section. You just need to describe what the figure is showing. Results of the figure are. Figure legend should also contain statistical data. So N, the number of animals, experiments, etc. presented, the mean, the median, the standard error, standard deviation, the p-values, the meaning of the symbols in the graph, and what test was used to determine p-values. And now journals are really emphasize the use of statistics when you publish a paper, and that you use the appropriate statistical test. So it's really important to provide those data. And then the methods for determining statistics should always be in the methods in a standalone section. So graph pad, sigma plot, whatever you use for your statistical methods. Finally, we'll get to the discussion. So I would say don't write an expansive essay that extrapolates widely from what you found. Start the discussion with a single sentence that states your main findings and discuss both the strengths and weaknesses of your study. So the first paragraph should have an interpretation and answer based on key findings and the supporting evidence. The subsequent paragraphs should compare or contrast to previous studies. As I said, the strengths and weaknesses or limitations of your study, any unexpected findings you had, what your hypothesis or model study. And I think that's really important too, because it's really, if you want to be publishing things that are going to be groundbreaking in the field, you want there to be things that others can test or others can build upon your research going forward. And that's what these high impact journals are looking for, because I mean, face it, what they really want to have is high impact factor. So the more people that are going to refer to your study, in other words, follow up on your study, try to prove or disprove your study, try to go forward from your study, the higher the impact factor of your publication will be. The last paragraph should have a summary, significance and implication, and unanswered questions and future research, kind of reiterating what I just said. And I'll say this again, so you need to avoid redundancy. Don't say the same thing in the abstract, intro, results, and discussion. Each one of them should say different things. Okay, so again, relate your study to what's already been found. How do your results fit in with what's known? What are the strengths and weaknesses? Why does your paper offer a different conclusion? Discuss what your study means. And as I said, what questions did your research not address? And avoid using the clean. Okay, for the methods, these actually sometimes are crucial in the triage process. So I've served on many an editorial discussion where the first reviewers of the paper, before it's even sent out for review, so the editors will say, well, they say that they found this, but it turns out they used completely inappropriate methods for coming to this conclusion. So you do want to make sure that your methods are really designed to address the questions you want to ask. So it's common for editors to reject a paper because authors use the wrong method to answer their question. You need to give enough detail so that a qualified reader is super important in terms of both journal publications and also NIH. So the ability to replicate studies is a big issue now, as you may know, when you submit an NIH grant, that you have to address this issue, how you're going to make sure that your study be repeated. So if your methods section is thin on details, editors also worried that you're hiding something. And a lot of journals now are requiring that detailed methods be posted online because of space limitations within the paper itself. So they either have their own website where you can post very detailed methods, or you can post them elsewhere. So for quantitative studies, editors will focus on 6 things: design, sample, intervention, outcomes measures, data analysis, and then ethics. And you need to walk the editor through by dividing the methods section with at least 6 subheads. So state clearly the design that was used. Is it observational? Is it interventional? Is it prospective or retrospective? Is it controlled or uncontrolled? If it's controlled, is it randomized or not? For randomized controls, how was the randomization done? What was the unit of randomization? Was it a cohort study, cross-sectional survey, or case-controlled study? So, for example, for randomized controlled studies, how do randomization? Were the numbers in sealed envelopes? Were the people who evaluated the data blinded to what the patients or samples were when they did? So I know in my own lab now, for example, when we do things that are quantified by microscopy, we print out pictures and give them to a person to know what the different samples are to do the analysis. So we can make sure that there's not bias in what we're measuring or what we're quantifying. So for biological samples, how did you determine your sample size, including the power calculation? How did you recruit participants? How did you ensure your sample was representative of the population? What measures did you use to reduce bias in the way you choose a sample for your inclusion and exclusion criteria? Outcome measures, what outcomes did you decide to measure when you designed your study? Specify your primary and secondary outcomes. Did you use a validated tool to measure these? And what steps did you use to reduce bias in the recording of the outcomes? And for data analysis, it's really critical to tell where is your data available for reviewers, editors, and future readers. So let me go across. So I'm skipping a few slides and we'll go back. So now many journals are requiring access to all raw data and require them to be deposited in a public database. And these are some examples of public databases. So for example, in my lab, we now deposit all of our raw data in a Mendeley file. And by raw data, I mean real-time PCR raw data, sequencing raw data, blots and gels that are uncropped, and basically everything that we did before it was manipulated to create the final picture. So Dryad is another site that's now being used by the PLOS organization. And if you go to this site, they have a lot other recommended repositories for data. And as I said before, lab protocols can also be deposited in a protocols website where they're given their own digital object identifiers. Many authors also now encouraging depositing preprints in bioRxiv or Authoria concurrent with submission. Let me go back. So for qualitative studies, the editor will focus on 5 qualitative approach appropriate. What steps people, for example, what stops people from using bed nets? That's qualitative. Quantitative, what proportion of people in Tanzania use bed nets? How were the subjects selected? Have the authors been explicit about their own views on the issue being studied? Because that can bias the outcomes, particularly in a qualitative. These were used for collecting data, and are they described in enough detail? And what methods were used to analyze the data? Okay, everything else, the references, cite them accurately, restrict yourself to the key ones, check the journal's house style. I would also say avoid over self-citation. because often reviewers will get angry if they, or editors, if they see that 50% of the citations are citing your own research. That either means that you haven't read the literature really well, or that it's a very narrow area of research if there aren't other people that are publishing in that field. Acknowledgements, author contributions, who did what. Now a lot of journals make you specify exactly what each author contributed to the paper, whether you have competing interests, whether you're funding, ethics statements. Now for animal research and human research, you even have to provide your approval number, and then the data availability statement. So making your data publicly available and state where it is. And we already talked about that. So papers can be held up for review if ethical considerations aren't sufficiently described. So studies involving human subjects must include the IRB approval information and informed consent from participants. And in most cases, it has to be written informed consent. For animal research, you need to have an information, including the protocol numbers and the fact that you accepted standards. Okay, so your paper's gone out for review, and now you got a major revision finding. So how do you respond to the reviewers? So first of all, you need to fully incorporate the reviewer's suggestions into a revised manuscript and address all the reviewer concerns in your rebuttal letter. And sometimes you can't address all the concerns. Maybe it's not technically feasible. Or some reviewers might ask you to do like another 2 years worth of experiments, which is an unreasonable request. And as long as you address that in your rebuttal letter and explain why it's not feasible to address that concern, usually, unless editors will, and you address the rebuttal letter to the editor, not to the reviewers. And you always need to be polite, even if you feel the reviewer was unfair or rude. And the reviewer is ignorant, essentially, which it's not going to help you, because often the paper gets sent back out for re-review and it goes back to the same reviewer. So you're shooting yourself in the foot if you're not polite. So what happens when you submit to a journal? We already went through this, but even if you feel like you've answered all the reviewers' comments, your paper can still be rejected. And what do you do when your paper is rejected? Just a part of research, and there's a lot to learn from it. Don't brush off the comments, be objective, carefully consider why the paper was rejected and make sure you understand. And even if your paper is rejected, if you feel strongly that it was rejected for unfair reasons, you can write to the editor and ask for them to reconsider. And in that, how you're going to address what the concerns are. And often papers can be resubmitted even after rejection but they will go through full review again. Okay. So the bottom line is you'll get published if you pick an important research question, if you use the right method to answer it, you wrote a short, clear account of the study that followed a tight structure and used effective writing to convey your message. And you keep in mind that science has become more cross-disciplinary, but sometimes, unfortunately, the reviewers have not. So you have to make sure that you're adequately addressing the question for the field. And I'm just going to end with one final thing, that there are many resources that provide technical and editorial help to authors. And particularly if you're new to writing papers, I would suggest taking advantage of these resources. And this website, for example, has a list of resources that are available to authors. And that's it. I'll stop there. I don't know
Yeah,
if
yeah, thank you so much. This wonderful lecture, and especially covering all the aspects of how to write a uh, high impact paper. So it's open to any questions, and some of the questions or comments are in the chat box. But if you have any comments, you can also come switch on our video, and maybe you can make some comments here.
So do you want me to answer questions from the chat box or?
Yeah, if you can, that will be great.
Okay. Yes, I said this at the beginning. If you want a copy of this presentation, please email me and I'll send you a copy of the presentation. So one question is, does the triage process and all these steps in general differ when doing quantitative versus qualitative research? No, I don't believe so. I think all of the tips that I gave you to avoid triage apply to whatever kind of study you're doing, whether it's a clinical study or a basic science study or a psychological study. The important thing is it has to be the appropriate type of research for the question you want to answer, and the question has to be interesting, more or less. So. If we work with people, what level of raw data is uploaded, how to do de-identification? I don't really know exactly. Of course, the data have to be identified, but the raw data, I guess, should be uploaded for all the individuals, and if you can de-identify it sufficiently. So I think that for that, you need to work probably with your IRB to figure out how to deposit the rules are for depositing the data. But the point is, if you're going to present analysis of a large group of patients, for example, someone has to be able to go in and be able to reanalyze your data without being able to identify the paper. So there has to be, the raw data has to be there in some fashion or form. So let's see, the next one is, so I understand based on the presentation that the research message should be clear in the first paragraphs of the paper introduction. Could you please elaborate on that? As I usually see the aims and goals of the paper stated at the end of the introduction. Yeah, I think what you need to do, as I said in the introduction, is to lay out what the bigger question is in the field. And that's the most important thing. And then to say something about, not necessarily to say, here we use this technique to figure out whether this is true or not in the introduction, but you need to set it out in such a way that we understand where you're going to go with this paper, what question you're going to ask in the beginning, basically. So a little bit of stating where the field is. So remember, I gave that example that it isn't clear, it is not yet known what are the first targets of trypanosome. And then they went on to describe what was known in the field. So we already know where this paper is going to go because they've set out what the big question in the field is. So that's kind of what I meant by that. And then you can wrap up at the end of the introduction with what specifically you did in your paper, essentially. So sometimes it happened that although the comments from reviewers were addressable and minor, we were not provided with a chance to revise the manuscript. The manuscript was outright rejected. How should we address that? So that probably means that they felt that the research wasn't of interest to their readers, or not of broad enough interest, or wasn't a conceptual advance. And the thing is, if it's a good rejection letter, they should say those things. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. If you feel, though, that you, in this case where it's not clear to you why the manuscript was rejected, you should feel free to contact the editor and get more insight into it. Because like I said, I try to make sure in my rejection letters or in the rejection letters of the editors I oversee that they put specifically into the letter why the paper was rejected, right? As well as sending all the comments. And they will say things like this paper was done, the research was done really well, but enough of a conceptual advance to be published in this journal, or it's too specialized for this journal, you know. And if your letter doesn't say that and you're not really clear, you should talk to the editor. And editors in general will respond to you. Maybe not quickly all the time, but how's it going to hurt, right? The worst thing that's going to happen is they're going to say, yes, it's still, and what could happen is they might reconsider and allow you to resubmit the paper. So that's it for questions, I think.
I have a question. Like Dr. Rose, thank you so much. I'm currently working a faculty member working on stem cells and neurodegenerative disease. So I had your very helpful information. I think it's very useful. Like I have a question about the abstract. So this is a critical component. Now some journals require only very short abstract, like 150 words maximum. But some traditional journals, for example, some like JCI 200 is, and some journals that require 350, 400, for example, like Brain. And I just wondering, like if some journals like this, there's a huge difference between this length of the abstract. For this very long one, like 400, 350, in addition to this critical information, what other information we need to include?
So, I mean, even if a journal, first of all, I don't think anybody requires 450. They have a maximum of 450.
Certainly.
So that doesn't mean you can't write a shorter abstract. But, you know, they do give you that leeway. I would say in that case, you probably are freer to write a little bit more experimental detail, basically. You know, again, I wouldn't give it a lot of technical detail, but you probably have more opportunity to say what the types of experiments you did. You know, that's in contrast to like a Nature abstract where you almost learn nothing from reading. It's really just a very short introduction to the paper, right? You don't really give hardly any detail. But yeah, I would say for those journals, you should still follow the same rules, but just provide a little bit more detail, basically, in the kind of results section of it, right?
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Or?
Oh, so you know what? I'll give you my email address in the chat so that if you want to, oh, somebody already did that. Okay.
Dr. Rose, I have a question, like in terms of publication strategies are also a sort of changing its, scenario in terms of more open access journals are coming up, and they charge for the publication, and it's like high. Sometimes it's very costly, like more than $3,000 to $5,000. And so, do you have any comments on where we should focus here? And some journals are hybrid; they have both options. So, where as a young or junior researchers, where they should focus.
Well, I think that's a big issue for everybody. So, just personally speaking, I do publish in open access journals. If I have the option, I never choose the open access option. I always choose the cheaper option. But yeah, I know the costs are really ridiculous these days. But most journals, if you have no funding, do allow you to ask to waive the fee or to get a reduced fee. I don't know if that's true for absolutely everybody, but there's usually a section in the submission process where you can explain that you don't have the funds to pay for the, and they do many journals, the journals that I am affiliated with will grant waivers to people if they can show that they have no funding. I mean, I have to be honest, a lot of times those waivers are given to authors in other countries, in underdeveloped countries, because there's really almost no funding for research. But yeah, I think it's a big problem these days, because you might want to publish in a journal, and the thought of spending $5,000 to publish in that journal, I don't know, it kills me to think about it. So, but you just have to do it. So if you don't have the funding, you can write to the editor. So the paper can be reviewed. You know, you should write to the editor, to the editorial staff actually, and ask if they grant waivers to people who, if you don't have the funding to cover the cost of publishing there.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I think we are almost time up. So thank you everyone who participated this event, and thank you for Dr. Susan Ross for your excellent talk, and motivating all of us to strategize our publications and giving us clear direction of how to write the paper and how to move forward. So thank you so much for your time and your the valuable information you shared with us. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Vicky, I think it went okay. I believe
Good,
so.
I think so, yeah.
It was an excellent talk.
Yeah, we had a lot of people. I'll have to
Yeah,
count
yeah.
them all up. Because some came and went, so I think we're close to 45, 46 people, so.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
And I think most importantly, she went into very detail, even how to write an abstract, how to write
Yeah.
is a very good for all of us to learn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yep.
We'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.